Good evening, and welcome to this special mental health edition of Doctors on Call. I'm Mary Morehouse, a psychotherapist with Insight Counseling of Duluth, and I will be your host for our program tonight on grief and loss. The holiday season can be an especially difficult time for those who have suffered a loss. Our program is here to answer your questions about mental health issues that may affect you, your family, or friends. Please call or email your questions, and we will do our best to address them. The telephone numbers and email address can be found at the bottom of your screen. Our expert guests this evening are Dr. Deb Semmelroth, is the founder and owner of the SELA Center for Grief and Loss in Duluth, and is a psychotherapist with multiple professional accreditations. And Regina Dixon is a licensed psychologist and a grief therapist with Essential Health in Duluth. Our phone and email questions are being received this evening by members of the WDSE staff who will bring them to me here in the studio. Now let's begin our discussion of grief and loss. Hi, Dr. Deb and Gina, thank you so much for coming here tonight. I'd first like to just start off so our viewers can know a little bit about each one of you and your practice. So Dr. Deb, if you could start out, tell us a little bit about what you do in your practice, please.
Mm-hmm. So I have my SELA, Center for Grief and Loss, and I'm a therapist, and I see primarily clients with grief, loss, and trauma.
Okay.
And I also do some teaching, adjunct faculty at Winona State, and I teach a class on grief, loss, and trauma there.
Okay.
In addition to, I teach some local courses on understanding your grief. I have a support group that is twice a month on suicide bereavement support group as well. And I serve on the Minnesota Department of Health suicide postvention task force.
Okay, wonderful.
So a little bit about me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And Gina.
Thank you for having me. I serve as the program manager with Essential Health Grief Support Services, and in that role I provide grief counseling along with a great team. And we also offer free support groups for grieving children, teens, and adults, and provide outreach and education and other supportive services.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So if we could just start by talking about the holidays and grief and what you are seeing in your practice. Dr. Deb, can you start with that? It's a big question, I know.
It is. However, where some therapists during the holidays, maybe they are seeing less clients. With grief and loss, I believe the amount of clients actually increases. So I see people with traumatic grief, suicide loss, child loss, and obviously other losses. And right now, clients are seeking to get through the holidays, to enter into a new year, and challenges and struggles surrounding that.
Okay. And Gina, what are you seeing with grief and loss and the holidays? Again, big question.
Well, I echo what Deb said, that the anticipation of holidays or other special days are often worse than getting through the day itself. And very often people will share that the second or third set of holidays were actually harder than the first, because the first set of holidays, people might have a lot of support from family or friends, and numbness kind of carries you through. And as time passes, sometimes, people don't always recognize the ongoing nature of grief, and it can kind of sideswipe them. And so it's not unusual for maybe people who haven't come in for a while to come back around the holidays and be feeling a lot of anxiety as we're heading into this season.
And that brings me to how can we support people who are going through grief and loss, right? During this holiday season, that we have a loved one. I think we all know people who are experiencing maybe a more of an acute loss right now, or going through an especially difficult time. What's the best way for people to support those who are going through grief and loss? Dr. Deb, sorry.
That's a great question, Mary. I think people are at a loss when they wonder how to support But I think some key pieces are supporting their holiday choices would be one piece, regarding what they would opt to do for the holidays, if they will participate in the traditional holidays. So inviting them, but not to be allowing them to have choice.
Okay.
That's a big part for supportive. I also think they can send a thoughtful card. Christmas cards, if we would look at the Christian tradition of Christmas cards, can be very difficult. People share family photos, etc. So maybe you opt to send a thoughtful card that is different, and that can be very supportive as well. I wrote down, because I thought of today, about the idea of listening without minimizing. And so being very supportive, not judging, giving it or giving advice, but that idea of minimizing, I think, can be really powerful to not do that.
Okay. Gina, your thoughts on how to support?
Yeah, I would say most importantly, what not to do is to avoid the grieving person. Oftentimes people feel like Typhoid Mary, they're walking down the aisle at the grocery store and feel people walking the other way because they're so uncomfortable or afraid that they're going to make the person cry, or afraid of saying the wrong thing. So, to Deb's point of reaching out, being proactive, and most grieving people appreciate when you share stories of the person and use their name, but meet the person where they're at and ask, how can I be most supportive? Invite to events, but then not to be offended if the moment comes and the person's just not able to participate in whatever they had the best of intentions of being a part of, because grief is messy and it comes and goes in waves, and people can't always predict what they're going to need a week from now, let alone 5 minutes from now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Dr. Deb, maybe you could take this post-traumatic growth. Can you describe what that is?
So I see post-traumatic growth as somewhat of a reconciliation, so to speak, of their grief experience. And post-traumatic growth doesn't necessarily mean it's after someone has grieved or mourned for a long period of time. Post-traumatic growth can occur in small ways, small bite-sized pieces all along the way. Joining a support group could be considered post-traumatic growth. Someone writing an article, journaling, lots of aspects that provide growth is how I would envision that.
Okay. Do you have anything to add to that, Gina?
Yeah, I would just say that process of integrating our losses and creating a new relationship with the person who died. And I'm careful that while we have many wonderful volunteers that co-facilitate our groups, are giving back as a result of what they have received from other group members, that would certainly be an example of post-traumatic growth. But I also caution people not to, pressure that or put that expectation on others, because, it's a matter of survival for many, many grievers. And so this idea that there's a silver lining or something good is going to come out, I think sometimes that's how people interpret that. And I think that's just unfair to grieving people. So. And I think hope is a powerful thing, and that's part of the reason why support groups can be so healing, is that people who are attending have empathy for each other's pain. I also co-facilitate an adult survivor of suicide support group, and very often there's really some beautiful interchange between group members that are able to validate each other's losses, but also share, this is what got me through that first set of holidays. Not in a way of giving advice, but just of laying out the buffet of choices.
Yeah, It's good to know sometimes for the beauty of support groups is to know that you're not alone.
Yeah.
Because I think grief, especially during the holidays, can feel very isolating and very, very, very alone. Which that kind of brings me, kind of looking at this, kind of more of this on a bigger scale, this global pandemic that we have been through for the last 2.5 years, almost coming up on 3 years here, and just really seeing this kind of a collective loss. Again, I have a daughter who graduated with the class of 2020 in high school, and she's a junior in college now, and she talked to me about it this week. So it's not grief and loss is not just the loss of a loved one, but it can also be the loss of through divorce, the loss of this nuclear family that we had, the loss of so many milestones that we weren't able to kind of get through in these last few years, and how kind of my mother-in-law died during the pandemic, and we waited 15 months before we were able to have a service. And so there were all those kind of more, I guess, more pandemic related. Gina, could you kind of see what what you're seeing with that?
I work in a medical center, and I can certainly speak to the wear and tear that the pandemic has had on medical providers, with wave after wave of upsurges of COVID, and also just caring for people coming in with other illnesses. And I don't think any of us expected COVID to impact us the way it has, in such an ongoing way. And so there has really been a loss of our old world as we knew it. And so my encouragement to people is to really pace themselves. We were talking about grief coming in waves, and that's certainly true with this pandemic, that it has impacted relationships in a multitude of ways as we gather, whether it's for funerals or weddings or other things. And just to be particularly gentle, that we never know what somebody else is, what road they're walking on. And so we may have really different experiences or different beliefs, but try to be respectful, because we see the tip of the iceberg usually of people's lives, and whether we're passing someone in the grocery store or whatever, just to recognize many people have experienced a multitude of losses during this pandemic, and continue to do so.
Absolutely.
If I could just add to that,
absolutely,
Mary,
Dr.
I was
Deb,
thinking of, as you talked about a family member's death, the idea of ritual is so vital in our world. The ritual of graduation, the ritual of weddings, but the ritual of funeral, of the idea of progressing with your own mourning and being denied. The ritual of funeral. And I think of that during this piece. So I would encourage folks, if they did not or were unable to have ritual during this time frame, that it is never too late to do ritual. And so if somebody didn't have a funeral, that maybe it's going to look differently now. And so that idea of how can you now integrate that into your life now to be able to have that full experience. And so I do think that's the challenge with one of the aspects with COVID that seems very obvious, but we don't name it as ritual, and how important that is within us as a culture as we have milestones, and then we miss those.
Yeah, it's been hard to miss those milestones these last few years. Yeah, go ahead.
And I was going to add to that when you were talking about the impact of rituals related to bereavement, but also visitor restrictions in the hospital, and how many families were not able to be with loved ones
yes.
while they were in the hospital, and how that really complicates grief too, that people can have delayed grief or, complicated grief because of woulda, coulda, shouldas, or not having those opportunities to say some of the things that they would have otherwise had. And again, that it's never too late. And very often within therapy, that's part of what we do, is provide support for, going back and meeting some of those really important needs that just weren't able to be met at the time.
Yeah, it's so true. All right, so we have a question here. How do you handle friends and family who feel it has been long enough since my partner passed and I should be over it by now? Yes. Can you take that first, Dr. Deb? Do you feel comfortable with that?
Yes, that's a hard one. That's a hard one. In our culture, we are in a society that places time limits on grief, and the idea that the magic 1 year or whatever that would be, that these time limits are placed on it, is to maybe have conversations with the person, educate them. And so those of us who are grievers, which most of us are in some way, shape, or form, grievers, we end up being the educators and letting people know. I also think offer them grace as well, because they may not understand, and it isn't their significant other who has died, and so to have a more understanding. But I also think it's education. It's helping them understand where I'm at. I think of, so often I've shared with clients, Dr. Alan Wolfeld has the Mourner's Bill of Rights. And I will, tell clients, or in the support group that I facilitate, post it on, family's refrigerator. And it reminds that, grief is those internal pieces, and mourning is that external aspect, and that mourning continues, and support is required. Like Gina was saying, that 2-3 years down the road, we're in a different development phase. The thawness, we've thawed out a bit, and now there's new realization that our world is not the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
So world assumptions are a big part, that others want to speed you along. And is it out of their own discomfort, or because we want the old you back? And we are changed beings by grief. And so I think that's the power of it. But so education is a big part.
Awesome.
Subtle ways, maybe.
Subtle. I like the Bill of Rights. That sounds great. All right, Gina, from a viewer. My mom died 1 year ago. Do most people go to counseling alone or with their family? And how long does the grieving process last?
That really speaks to our last conversation, isn't it?
Very much so, yeah.
And I'm so glad we're having this conversation, and I'm so glad that this viewer shared that question, because there is a lot of misinformation and a misconception that somehow we get through that first anniversary and we're magically having closure, and it just doesn't work that way. That grief does in fact come in waves, and it's been decades since my father died by suicide, and there are moments that are still bittersweet around the holidays in particular. And so to just to know that you're not alone if it feels like it's taking longer than you could ever imagine. And remind me the other part of that question.
Yes, absolutely. So do most people go to counseling alone or with their family?
I think it's really a mixed bag. I would say the majority of people come in individually, and sometimes that can be because different family members need different things, and having your own space to be heard and to be able to share without any kind of judgment can really be a tremendous gift. I would say particularly families with young children, it can be really helpful for a parent to have their own time to do some of their grieving, but then come together and meet as a family with their child's therapist to better understand their needs and how they can grieve together and create ritual together. And so that's how I would answer that question in my experience.
Okay, great, great. All right, Dr. Deb, we'll go back to you. Can one grieve for their own losses during childhood?
Say that again, Mary.
Can someone grieve for their own losses during childhood?
Can they grieve for their own losses during
during
childhood?
childhood.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. So I think of, Gina works or has worked a lot with children, and actually has done a beautiful class that I recall that she had offered in the past with children going through grief. And I think of the power of allowing children to grieve, and it's going to be very different than adults. So children can be so impromptu with I think of how they will just bring up the person's name, and they will learn quickly if that's not being allowed in a household. And so I think of that with children, to allow them to include them in conversations, maybe in part of some processes, whatever that might look like. And then I do believe then, as people get older, that grief isn't just resolved at age 8 or age 11 or 15. As we developmentally go through spaces in our own lives, things arise in us.
Yeah, and this the next question. Thank you for that, Gina. So, it's along the same vein. Where do kids fit into the family grieving? And I think that's so. I had a cousin who died a year and a half ago now, and the children of him were at very different stages of grief. High school, college age, and then the mom. So again, those were older, but how do they fit into kind of the whole family grieving, with everyone really grieving at their own pace? How does one handle that?
Particularly young children tend to have shorter grief spans, where, as you say, they might be really spontaneous with expressing something and then want to go play with Legos. And so I think it's important to meet children where they're at and provide opportunity for support, and also always offer choices. I would also say something about secondary losses. I mentioned that I was in 4th grade when my father died by suicide. And in addition to the physical loss of my father, there were all these secondary losses. We had to move to a new house and a new school, and I couldn't see my friends anymore. We left pets behind. My mom went from being a stay-at-home mom that was pretty with it to a pretty traumatized mom that had to go back to work. And so to be aware, not just for kids, but for adults, that secondary losses can really be ongoing, and it's important to acknowledge those, and as we're able to support people in navigating those secondary losses, but particularly for children, I would say the loss of the old normal, how things used to be at home. We used to sit around the table and have dinner, and now mom's too sad for that. And so as we can name those secondary losses, it helps to navigate them together as a family, if it's safe to do that. And in some families, it's not safe to do that for a variety of reasons. Maybe there's drugs or alcohol in the family, or other stressors. And so sometimes, as the other caller had said, that support doesn't happen until months, decades later, and that it's never too late to do our work for childhood losses.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Anything that you wanted to add?
No,
kind
that
of
was good.
That was good.
It was very good.
Of course, it's very good. So we're just real quickly. We talked a little bit earlier about the stages of grief that we all know, and I know Dr. Deb, you said you prefer phases to stages, and sometimes I know kind of the end goal is I want to get to that acceptance piece. So just real quickly, can you just kind of go through kind of your philosophy of that?
Well, I'll use Dr. Alan Wolfeld, who's a Center for Loss and Life Transition. He has what's called a companioning model, and it's really a beautiful one for peer support. It's what I use in the support group, so people as they begin to support one another and go off in community. His are, and he calls them needs of mourning, 6 needs of mourning. Okay. So his first one, he talks about acknowledging the reality. And then he goes into embracing the pain of the loss, remembering the person who died, developing a new self-identity, and then searching for meaning. And that idea of reconciliation is important. Not so much acceptance, but reconciliation.
Yes. That's wonderful. What a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much, Dr. Deb. I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Deb Semmelroth and Gina Dixon, for their time and expertise tonight, and for those of you who called in or emailed questions. Doctors on Call will be off the next 2 Thursdays for our holiday break. Please join Mary Owen for our next show on Thursday, January 5th for a program on Indigenous health, when her guests will be Dr. Arnie Vanio, Roxanne DeLille, and Ricky Defoe. I'm Mary Morehouse for the guests and crew here at WDSE. Thank you for watching, and happy holidays.